Welcome to Sounds of Resistance YouTube channel. In the 8th month of the Ukraine-Russia war, the unstoppable progress of the Ukrainian heroic army continues rapidly, and Crimea is no longer a dream. Ukrainian tanks are pushing through the center of Kherson, while the Ukrainian armed forces intend to completely destroy the Russian presence in Kherson and even in the Crimea. A huge Ukrainian offensive is on the horizon as Ukraine's newly acquired HIMARS missiles, coastal defense missiles, and anti-radiation missiles and Ghost kamikaze drones light the way to Crimea. Zelensky's lions are hunting Russian troops one by one, especially on Ukraine's southern fronts. While the successful operations of the Ukrainian army in the Kherson region threaten the Russian army of approximately 30,000 soldiers around Kherson, and even the entire Russian presence in the Crimea, Russian leader Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin administration were alarmed. In the early days of the war, the Russian army brought it to the point of exhausting all its arsenal and elite soldiers to occupy Ukrainian territory. Since February 24, 2022, Russian leader Vladimir Putin has been furiously conducting offensive operations on Ukrainian territory. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, maintained its defensive positions in this process, continuing their resistance until almost all the resources of the Russian army were exhausted. The Ukrainian armed forces first cut off the Russian army's shipping routes. Important logistics routes such as Izium, Kupiansk, and Liman were taken under control by the Ukrainian heroes, and the Russian army was prevented from sending additional military resources. Thus, the Russian army began to inflict huge casualties on most of the Ukrainian fronts because the Ukrainian armed forces, using their sharp genius, suddenly began to conduct dawn operations against the Russian troops. The Ukrainian army was aware that the Russians were short of ammunition and soldiers. Now it was the turn of the Ukrainian heroes. Zelensky's lions reared up in a sudden process and put great pressure on the Russian army. Every day, the news of the liberation and dawn operations organized by the heroes of Ukraine was on the agenda. The Russian army did not even understand what had happened. The ingenious regional liberation operational plans prepared by the top generals of the Ukrainian armed forces were beginning to bear fruit. Russian leader Vladimir Putin and his army were getting more and more severe blows with each passing day. The losses of the Russian army were over 60,000. Now the Russian leader had to do something. And finally, Vladimir Putin, unable to withstand the pressures of the Ukrainian army, decided to mobilize throughout Russia. Leader Putin and the Russian army were in a great stalemate. The Russians who returned to the Ukrainian lands they occupied at the beginning of the war, one by one, did not want to lose any more soldiers and were trying to replace the soldiers they lost. Vladimir Putin thought that he could replace the soldiers he lost with the mobilization decision and recapture the Ukrainian lands. But Putin continued to walk on a path that was once again disappointing. The Ukrainian heroes had already reached the Kherson region and were based in the key city of the war, the Crimea. The move that brought Putin to himself was the Ukrainian army's base in Crimea. For the Russian leader, Crimea and its surroundings were very important. Thanks to the epic operations of the Ukrainian heroes, the Kherson region gradually began to be cleared of occupation troops. Now the Ukrainian army had opened the doors of the road to Crimea. Russian leader Vladimir Putin concentrated the volunteer soldiers he sent to Ukraine on the southern fronts with the decision of mobilization, in order to put a stop to this course of the Ukrainian army. In Russia, after Ukraine's victory in Kherson, a situation of panic began to prevail, because the Crimea region is one of the most important strategic places in the Ukrainian-Russian war, and even the most important. Crimea, which was annexed by Russia illegally in 2014, was waiting for the Ukrainian army to be liberated. Ukrainian President Zelensky, who attaches more importance to this region than the Russian leader Vladimir Putin gives to Crimea, does not stop at Crimea in every statement. Ukraine's leader, who kept Crimea apart from the first days of the Ukraine-Russia war until today, is now very close to acquiring this region. Thanks to the Kherson victory and other gains in the south, Ukraine gradually advanced to the Crimea, while the Russians began to seek ways to regain their dominance in Kherson. Because if the Ukrainian heroes completely capture Kherson and its environs, it will be much easier for them to take Crimea. The Russian administration also sees Ukraine's capture of Crimea as the end of the war. That's how important Crimea is for the Ukraine-Russia war. Now let's make an evaluation by considering all the developments. If the Russian administration does not give up on Crimea and deploys most of the Russian army soldiers to Crimea and its surroundings, it will put other fronts at risk. Putting the Russian army at risk on other Ukrainian fronts will increase the gains of the Ukrainian heroes in the eastern region and other fronts, and maybe even the Russians will have returned all of the Ukrainian lands they occupied to Ukraine. If the Russian administration, which is in a very serious crisis, returns the occupied Ukrainian lands to its owner, namely Ukraine, it will lose Crimea as well. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is actually aware of the existence of this danger. You may remember that Vladimir Putin supplied nearly 300,000 of the country's citizens to the Russian army with a mobilization decision he declared throughout Russia. Immediately after leader Putin's declaration of mobilization, Russian Defense Minister Shoigu pointed out the secret article of the mobilization decree, Article 7, and underlined that the number of 300,000 Russian volunteer citizens could rise to 1 million over time. So why did the Russian defense minister make such a statement right after Putin? The answer is actually quite simple. Everything was going according to plan. The Russian administration was also acting in a way that was aware of what was going on with Zelensky. The Russian leader predicted that the Ukrainian advances could be as far as the Crimea. Therefore, using the Russian Defense Ministry, Putin aimed to increase the number of 300,000 Russian soldiers in his mobilization decision to 1 million. Because if Putin cannot increase this number, the Ukrainian army will take Crimea from the Russians, thanks to its unstoppable operations. But the Russian leader's mobilization plans are not going as he had hoped at the moment. On the contrary, thousands of anti-mobilization protests are held across Russia. Russian citizens continue to leave their country because of the mobilization decision, because they no longer want to fight. That's why the Russian leader started recruiting volunteers from the minority republics. Putin severed the bond between the fear and oppression he applied and the Russian people. Russian citizens no longer trust any state institution, including their leaders. In particular, the fact that the Russian armed forces included many Russian citizens in the army, although they did not meet the criteria for military service, greatly increased the uneasiness in the country. The Russian Defense Ministry announced that these mistakes would be corrected, but no steps were taken in this regard. As part of the mobilization, full-time students were not to be recruited into the Russian army. But Russian National Guard regiments sent many Russian students from universities across the country to the Ukrainian fronts. Russian leader Putin is going through such a difficult time that while each step he takes leaves a mistake behind, he becomes unable to take the next step. While the situation in Russia is such an inextricable situation, Russia's job will become even more difficult if the Western and U.S. aid packages to the Ukrainian army continue. In particular, the U.S. government has started to work on a new aid package for the Ukrainian army. The aid package that the U.S. will send to Ukraine includes additional HIMARS long-range missile systems. It's expected that the iron pillars of the war will fall on the Russians when the aid package, which the U.S. government is currently keeping secret, but which is expected to change the course of the Ukraine-Russia war, reaches the Ukrainian army. Hoping to meet you again with warm developments. Don't forget to follow our channel. You can be notified of new videos by opening the bell.